The first time I saw Pastor Jonah's real face was the night he tried to kill my mother. It was not the kind of face you expect a pastor to have. His eyes were too dark, too empty. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were not human. And his hands, God help me, his hands, were stretched towards my mother's throat, fingers twisting like they did not belong to him. That was the night everything changed. How it started. Our village was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. We did not have a big church, just a small brick building with wooden benches inside. The last pastor had left years ago, and no one had replaced him. People still prayed, but mostly in their homes. Then Pastor Jonah arrived. Nobody knew where he came from. One day, the church doors were open again, and there he was, preaching. He said he had been called by God to save our village. He had a deep voice, the kind that made you want to listen. He spoke of miracles, of healing, of driving out evil spirits. At first, people were not sure about him. But then strange things started happening. A woman who had been sick for months suddenly got better after he prayed for her. A man who had been struggling to find work got a job the day after Pastor Jonah laid hands on him. Even the village drunkard, who had been wasting his life away, suddenly stopped drinking and started coming to church. People believed. I believed too. Until I saw what was really happening. The dreams. My mother was one of the first people to trust Pastor Jonah. She had been struggling for years, ever since my father died. She worked hard, selling vegetables at the market, making sure I could go to school. But things were never easy. When she heard about the pastor, she was the first in line for his prayers. She started going to church every evening, coming home late, her eyes shining with something I did not understand. He is a true man of God, she would say. You should come with me, my son. But after a few weeks, she changed. She started having strange dreams. She would wake up in the middle of the night, breathing hard, sweat covering her face. I would hear her whispering prayers under her breath, but they did not sound like prayers. They sounded like begging. Then she stopped eating. Her body grew weak, her eyes sunken. She still went to church every night, but she barely spoke during the day. I asked her what was wrong, but she only shook her head. Then one night, I woke up to a sound. It was coming from her room. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood go cold. She was standing in the middle of the room, facing the wall. Her back was stiff, her arms hanging by her sides. But her head was tilted at a strange angle, like her neck was broken. And she was whispering. Fast. I could not understand the words. More. I called out, my voice shaking. She did not move. Then, suddenly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were wide, but they did not look like her eyes. They were too dark, too empty. Her mouth opened, and for a second, I thought she was going to scream. But she only said one thing. He is not who he says he is. Then she collapsed. The truth. The next morning, I tried to ask her about it, but she did not remember anything. She only said she felt tired. I knew something was very wrong. So I decided to follow her. That night, when she left for church, I waited a few minutes, then slipped out of the house and followed her. The church was full of people, all of them swaying, clapping, speaking in tongues. Pastor Jonah stood at the front, eyes closed, hands raised. But something felt wrong. The air was too heavy. The singing was too loud. And when Pastor Jonah opened his eyes, for a split second, I saw something. His eyes were red. I blinked, and they were normal again. But my heart was pounding. I slipped to the back of the church, staying in the shadows. I did not know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find it. Then I saw the door. It was small, hidden behind the pulpit. Nobody was looking at it. Nobody even seemed to notice it was there. I waited until Pastor Jonah started shouting about fire and brimstone, then I moved. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a small room. Dark. The smell hit me first, something rotten, something old. My hands shook as I reached for the lantern on the wall. When the light filled the room, I felt my stomach turn. There were jars. Dozens of them, lined up on shelves. Inside each one was something floating in a dark liquid. Pieces of hair. Teeth. Fingers. Things I could not even name. And on the table in the middle of the room, a photo of my mother, with red marks drawn all over her face. I turned and ran. The nightmare. I did not stop running until I reached home. I locked the door, breathing hard, my mind racing. My mother was still at church. I had to get her away from him. I waited. Every minute felt like an hour. Then, just after midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, steady. Coming towards the house. I moved to the window and looked out. It was not my mother. It was him. Pastor Jonah stood in the moonlight, staring at the house. His face was blank, but his eyes were the same ones I had seen in the church. Black. Empty. Then he smiled. And I heard the lock click open. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and backed into the corner. The door creaked as it swung open. My mother stepped inside first. She looked wrong. Her head was tilted again, her arms limp at her sides. And behind her, Pastor Jonah stepped in. His face was still smiling, but his hands were reaching for her throat. I did not think. I ran at him, slashing with the knife. But the knife did not touch him. It passed through him like smoke. He laughed. A deep, slow sound that made my blood turn to ice. You should not have entered that room, he said. My mother's body jerked like a puppet. Her lips moved, but her voice was not hers. It was deep, wrong. Leave, my son, she whispered. I screamed. And then, suddenly, she collapsed. Pastor Jonah staggered back, clutching his chest. His face twisted in pain. For the first time, he looked afraid. He took one step back, then another, then he turned and ran. I ran to my mother, shaking her, calling her name. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in weeks, they were clear. What happened? She whispered. I did not have the words. The aftermath. The next day, Pastor Jonah was gone. Nobody knew where he had gone. His house was empty. The church was locked. People said he had left in the middle of the night. I knew the truth. We burned everything in that room. But sometimes, at night, I still hear footsteps outside the house. Slow. Steady. And when I look out the window, I see a shadow standing at the edge of the trees. Watching.